Argyre is a massive basin on Mars. It is around 1,400 kilometers in diameter. Its surface area of 1.5 million kilometers square is close to the surface area of Alaska. Compared to the surrounding area, it is about 3 to 4 kilometers deep. Despite its size, Argyre is far from being the largest basin on Mars. It is also not the deepest basin. On pretty much the same latitude is another basin called Hale. Its surface area is nearly 3 times greater, and it is around 6 to 7 kilometers deep, making it the deepest place on Mars. However, when it comes to surface area, the massive Northern Borealis Basin is by far the largest, covering about 35% of the entire surface area of Mars. That surface area is also the equivalent to the surface area of Asia. The Borealis Basin is also made up of many sub-basins, so Argyre is not the deepest nor the largest basin on Mars. Despite that, it has an impressive number of bizarre patterns and features on its surface. NASA's Mars Reconnaissance orbiter reached Mars in 2006, and it managed to capture some amazing images of patterns on Argyre. Usually they were captured at an altitude of 250 kilometers. The high-resolution camera on the probe captured images of the Martian terrain with great precision at 30 centimeters per pixel. Most of the images shown in this video will be from the Mars Reconnaissance orbiter. Now, this is a topographic map of Argyre, and this map gives great visual clarity to large features on Mars, such as this basin. However, even without the topographic map, from space, Argyre can be distinguished somewhat easily. In this image, the sharp mountain range on the southern part of the basin is clearly visible. This image was captured by NASA's Viking 1 orbiter that arrived on Mars in 1976. The Argyre impact basin is ancient, with an estimate placing its age at around 3.9 billion years old. Mars itself is around 4.5 billion years old, so this basin was present during most of Mars's history. What is quite odd about this basin is that there is a massive circle around the rim which has countless mountains that are around 6 kilometers above the floor of the basin. Let's take a closer look at some of these mountains. For example, this mountain on the eastern side of the basin. A closer look reveals massive gullies. The length of some of these gullies is around 6 kilometers. That is larger than what is typical for gullies on Mars. On Earth, gullies frequently form due to water eroding terrain. That also might be the mechanism through which some gullies also formed on Mars. A place with some of the most bizarre layered formations on Mars is present in the crater Gale, a massive crater within Argyre. Its diameter is around 220 kilometers, making it one of, if not the largest crater in Argyre. Its surface area is nearly 40,000 kilometers square. Here's how this crater looks like from space. This was captured by NASA's Viking 1 orbiter. On the southern side, that is below this mountainous arc formation, is this vast region that contains all sorts of bizarre patterns. This is a more zoomed-in view of what we are taking a look at. Let's take a look at the image captured here. This one is nicely showcasing the largely chaotic fields of layered rock going in all sorts of directions. Next, let's take a look at this image. This one shows that the chaotic pattern abruptly ends when this more elevated region appears. Next, let's take a look at an image captured here. This one shows this island surrounded by the chaotic pattern. But not all of the formations here are chaotic. Let's take a look at an image that was captured at the edge of this vast field. As we can see, the slope here has this very coherently layered formation that goes from the top of the slope to the bottom. As the slope is closer to the bottom, the separation between the lines also gets smaller. Now this entire region with these bizarre patterns has a surface area of about 1,400 kilometers square, so it is relatively large. Whether or not the patterns in this region formed due to water is not certain. Another interesting thing is that right next to this region are these dark streaks. A zoomed-in view reveals that these are whirlwind tracks. They are created by whirlwinds and are present on many different places on Mars. Here is one whirlwind captured by the Curiosity rover in 2020. This is a view of a whirlwind from space. This was captured by the Mars Reconnaissance orbiter. This whirlwind in particular is 800 meters tall and 30 meters wide. Layered formations are also present on other parts of the surface. Another prominent one is the one that is located between the countless mountains of the western side of Argyre. There is this place which has these two circular formations of layered rock. Next to them is also this shoreline-looking area with lots of layers. Zooming out of this area a bit reveals just how incredibly odd-looking it is. Just a bit to the north of this place, also between the mountains, is a massive sand dune. It is so large that it could also be considered a mountain. It stretches for around 10 kilometers, and it has a maximum height of 500 meters above the surrounding floor. Along the top, what can also be seen is Gullies. And going again a bit further to the north, there is this location. It has these sand dunes, but what is somewhat interesting looking are these sand lines that are parallel to each other. Speaking of sand dunes, let's take a look at another massive crater within Argyre. This one is called Hook. It has a diameter of about 140 kilometers. This crater is overall the deepest spot of Argyre. This image was captured in this crater. What is revealed are massive sand dunes that are saturated with tracks left by whirlwinds. Here is another one showcasing the dunes present in this crater. A more zoomed out view reveals these dunes are not typical for this crater, but they do cover a huge area. Another area that has sand dunes is this very eastern side of Argyre. It is incredibly topographically flat. However, in the midst of this huge flat area are 27 sand dunes, and they have a shape of an apostrophe. Here's how these apostrophe sand dunes look like up close. They very much stick out in comparison to the rest of the flat surface that is here. Further to the north, along this flat area, is also another odd location. Here, there are these countless small domes densely packed together. Even further to the north, above the channel formation, is a crater called Hale. At around 140 kilometers in diameter, it is almost the exact same size as the crater Hook. However, unlike Hook, which has a rather flat and short rim, the crater Hale has an incredibly sharp and tall rim, with some parts of the rim rising around 4 kilometers above the floor of the crater. Here is an up-close image of the rim. It's quite clear that it has these gullies. Here is a view of a rim casting a shadow. The sharp transition between the brightness and the darkness showcases just how sharp these edges are. Now, in the central mountains of the Hale crater, something odd is going on. On the slopes on one of these mountains, recurring lines appear. Just maybe they are caused due to flowing liquid water that is incredibly salty. The salt lowers the freezing point of water, so with enough salt, water can stay liquid under very cold temperatures. Now let's take a look at what is going on in the floor of this crater. This image reveals that the relatively flat floor of the Hale crater has these huge areas which are densely packed with pits. Along with pits, there are also these brighter lines that intersect with pits. Next, let's take a look at this valley that is to the west of the crater Hale. A close-up image reveals the floor of the valley situated between two elevated sides. An even more zoomed-in view of the floor reveals these chunks of surface that are elevated from the surrounding terrain. The chunks also have pretty sharp edges. The large chunk in the middle also has these fractures that abruptly end once the edge of the chunk is reached. This large chunk very much sticks out compared to the surrounding terrain, which is saturated with flow patterns. Just a bit to the west of this valley is this place which has somewhat similar looking patterns, so we can clearly see a mountain casting a shadow over a crater that is on the slope of that mountain. However, right next to the mountain, on the floor, there are these densely packed chunks of surface, and that pattern ends rather abruptly. Beyond this line there is just regular Martian terrain. Argyre has quite a few relatively large valleys. Let's take a closer look at this one on the northern side of Argyre. In this image, the sun angle makes the elevated regions cast a nice shadow, which gives more visual clarity to the fact that this is a valley. The floor of this valley is mostly very flat, but it is lightly fractured. However, in the middle there is a flow pattern that disrupts the flatness of this area. This valley is around 300 kilometers long. Another notable valley of Argyre in terms of size is located on the southern side. This valley is around 300 kilometers long. This is how the up-close image of the valley looks like. Due to a lack of shadow in this image, it is somewhat hard to distinguish it from the rest of the terrain. However, it is still noticeable. Overall, this close-up image reveals that this valley is pretty featureless. Just a bit to the east of this valley is another valley. This one is around 250 kilometers long, and it is connected to this crater. Going a bit further to the east, there is this massive mountain. Here is a more up-close view of what this mountain looks like. Its tallest point rises about 8 kilometers above the floor of Argyre. So from that high point, you would be able to see around 200 kilometers into the distance of the floor of Argyre. Now let's finally take a look at what is going on in this vast floor of Argyre. So very close to the previously mentioned mountain is this location. These patterns are surprisingly coherent. They almost look artificial. Going a bit to the west, next to these mountains, is this bizarre terrain with countless white lines intersecting. Apparently, these form when the season changes and the south polar ice cap starts growing. So these lines might be made up of dry ice. Argyre is about 1,500 kilometers away from the permanent south polar ice cap. Next, let's take a look at this odd-looking valley. The floor of this valley is around 1 kilometer below the walls of this valley. And in this image we can see how those huge walls look like. It is pretty obvious that these walls have layered rock. Close to this very irregular crater is this very steep depression around 300 meters below the surrounding terrain. As we can see in this up-close image, the walls of this steep depression are also layered, while the floor is surprisingly flat. The floor is also filled with a bunch of streaks. Next, let's take a look at what is going on in the center of Argyre. This image was captured close to the center. Although it may seem like it is featureless, a more zoomed in view reveals a massive number of these thin parallel streaks that are likely made up of fine Martian sand. So those were some of the most bizarre patterns found so far on Argyre. Sending a rover to just one of these locations of Argyre would likely yield very interesting results. But out of the places mentioned here, the huge layered formation found within the crater Gale would probably be the most interesting location to explore further. However, considering its extremely chaotic terrain, it would probably be very challenging for a rover to traverse on that terrain. So the next best thing is probably the layered formation found on the very western side of Argyre. As of now, we can only hope that Argyre is someday going to be explored further with a rover.